Welcome back to Next Act Ninjas, the #1 podcast for becoming a master of your lifestyle longevity. I'm your host, Rachael Van Pelt, retired health span scientist turned realtor and coach. And today we're going to explore the concept of iterative retirement. What I mean by that is not early retirement, but rather taking a more experimental and incremental approach to working less over time. A sort of retire before you retire approach. Because why wait until age 65 to jump off that cliff, hoping that you crafted your golden parachute right? Companies don't do this, do they? They don't expect their first product launch to be their final. They move from version to version and market test along the way, don't they? We've recently witnessed this with OpenAI's ChatGPT deployment over the last 18 months. They released 3.0, 3.5, 4.0, and so on. It's called iterative deployment. You launch a product, you test it, you get market feedback, pivot, refine, relaunch, etc. Scientists, we do the same thing. We formulate a hypothesis based on existing data, collect more data, test the hypothesis, we refine it, collect more data, retest it, and so forth. The military, they do this as well. They do some recon, gather intel, take the smallest reasonable step, gather new intel, they regroup, revise, move forward, rinse, and repeat. In my opinion, we need to start thinking the same way when it comes to deploying our next act. Because if we wait until age 65 or 67 to retire with a big bang, all or nothing, succeed or fail approach, what's the most likely scenario? It probably won't be optimal, will it? What if instead we approached our next act like an entrepreneur, a scientist, or military strategist? The major advantage to taking an iterative approach is that it gives us flexibility, adaptability. It gives us a runway to pivot. It also provides room for learning and personal growth. You can think about iterative deployment as having two parts to it, two pieces of the puzzle, if you will, an incremental piece and an experimental piece. Incremental is taking your retirement in steps. This is when you do something like transition from full-time work to part-time work. Maybe throw in some volunteer work. You move through phases of semi-retirement. It could also mean moving from your full-time corporate job to a full-time self-employed gig or a part-time consulting gig. The incremental approach is a logical and linear phased step down. The experimental approach, on the other hand, is less stair-stepped. It's more of a testing the waters to determine if something is a good fit before you go all in. One type of experiment might be taking a sabbatical for 6 to 12 months so you can find out what that time freedom feels like. It's the opportunity to discover where you spend the majority of your time. Are you really satisfied skiing and golfing full time, or do you prefer having something to challenge you cognitively? Another experiment might look like, instead of selling your home and committing to RV life full time, you rent an RV and you hit the road for 3 to 4 months to see if it's all you dreamed. It could be experimenting with a side hustle before you leave your day job and make it your encore career. Or maybe you invest in a rental property and you test whether you have the wherewithal to manage 2 properties before you commit to becoming a full-time sunbird, splitting your time between 2 locations. You get the idea. With each experiment or incremental step, you are simply collecting data, gathering intel, hypothesis testing, playing with possibilities. This is the fun part. There's no one size fits all. There probably isn't even a one size fits you indefinitely. Forget one and done. Start with version 1.0 and iterate from there. Start early. Be prepared to reinvent and rewire yourself along the way. because what fits you at 55 won't necessarily be the same as what fits you at 70. That's okay. Again, this is where your life gets fun. Creating your best next act won't happen overnight. Like anything worthwhile, it takes a bit of trial and error. It takes some learning, growing, innovating. There will be honeymoon phases, uncomfortable transitions, grieving periods, you name it. Be prepared. Think of it as a developmental stage of life, analogous to your transition from adolescence to young adulthood. You remember that? Such transitions can be unstable, even a bit messy. And that's probably a good thing, because usually on the heels of stability comes boredom and a life that shrinks very quickly. I doubt you want that. In fact, if you're listening to this podcast, then I'm guessing you are a longevity-minded adult that is still looking to expand your life, not shrink from it. So let's dive a little deeper into how you might plan for an iterative retirement. I like to think of it metaphorically like planning for a trip around the world. Of course, you can just save up as much money as possible, head to the airport and wing it from there. 3 sheets to the wind, so to speak. No planning, just go wherever the wind takes you. An unplanned, spontaneous trip like that could be a lot of fun, but it could just as easily be a real dud. You could run yourself ragged trying to see too much, or you might malinger too long in one place and completely miss seeing any of those bucket list destinations you were hoping to see. You could run out of money being frivolous, or you could miss out on fun being too frugal. With no planning whatsoever, who knows what you're going to get? Conversely, you probably don't want to craft out a complete hour-by-hour itinerary for that year-long trip around the world either. Too much rigidity would probably lead to you missing out on some real spontaneous fun, the kind of fun you would never have dreamed of. Your ideal probably lies somewhere in between, doesn't it? It's where you design your trip of a lifetime, starting with some broad brushstroke itinerary, something that ensures you're going to hit all your major destinations, figuring out what you can afford to spend along the way, but building plenty of leeway in for those spontaneous side trips or frivolous, unplanned expenditures. Even better would be if you could experiment with some smaller practice trips before you went on that around the world tour. Because like many other things, it takes practice. It's unpredictable. And expectations vary from person to person, don't they? Some people like to spend all their time meandering through museums and castles, while others want to hike and bike and scuba dive. Some go with the flow, while others get overwhelmed by too many choices, too much newness. Regardless, experimenting will help you discover what fits you best. Do you like a whirlwind adventure, or do you need a slower, more relaxed pace? Do you adapt to new cuisines and time zones quickly, or do you need more time to transition? There's no right or wrong way. It's your taste, your personality. But wouldn't it be nice to know your preferences before you commit? Same is true when it comes to planning your next act. What if you experimented with smaller bouts of retirement? In science, we call this pilot testing. It's when you conduct a small experiment before you commit all of your resources to the big experiment. Find out, is your employer amenable to a phased retirement, a sabbatical, part-time work, 9-month work contracts? If so, take advantage of this opportunity. Many companies these days are looking for ways to cut down on costs, while at the same time they want to retain valuable talent. In other words, they want your lifetime of experience, your corporate memory. But let's face it, it gets expensive, doesn't it? What if you help them find a creative way to keep you on, pay you less, while you get some months off every year? Wouldn't that be a win-win scenario? A so-called practice retirement can be really eye-opening. Experiment to find out what your preferences are. What suits your personality? How much do you need to live on? You just may learn things about yourself you didn't quite expect from these trials. For example, one of the things that happens to many people during this transition phase of life is a struggle with loss of identity. This is particularly hard when identity has been tied to a career for decades. I experienced this myself when I retired from academia. I'd been a clinical research scientist for 25 years, but as soon as I was no longer working in the lab, doing experiments, writing grants, I wondered if I should stop calling myself a scientist. I acutely felt the loss of my long-held identity. Am I saying that you should no longer call yourself a teacher or a nurse or an entrepreneur when you stop teaching, nursing, running a business? Of course not. It's just that our culture likes to put us in tidy boxes. And when somebody asks, what do you do? It can be challenging if you're in transition, if you're retiring but not yet quite retired. You may find yourself grieving the loss of your identity. It can be scary, but it can also be liberating. Just be prepared for this mentally and emotionally. If you plan to experiment with sabbatical or phase retirement, just know that this is a possible thing you might struggle with. The other thing that many don't expect is how much it can impact relationships, particularly marriage. When one person is retired and the other isn't, it can put a strain on things. Even if both partners are retired, when each person has very different expectations about what's next, this can lead to conflict. I don't bring this up to scare you. I just say it so you can be prepared. You don't want to wait until you're traveling around the world to discover one person wants to spend 3 months on the beach in Portugal while the other wants to go hike the Great Wall of China. Wouldn't knowing this in advance be a good idea? Most definitely. Talk to your partner. Again, this is the fun part. Just like planning a great vacation, it is fun to fantasize about your next act. Now, you're not going to be able to prepare for everything in advance, but a little bit of visualization, proper planning, some trial runs, it's going to go a long way towards helping you create the optimal experience. In fact, if you want to squeeze all the juice out of your next act, I would argue that your mental preparation for this phase of life is just as important as taking care of your health and building your wealth. But have fun with it. Planning the trip can be almost as much fun as the actual trip itself. Take the time to dream and discover your tastes, your preferences. Talk to your loved ones about expectations. Be prepared to test, refine, pivot, retest, iterate. Each revised version of your next act will be better than the last. I can confidently say this after 8 years of my own iterating. Look, when you were a new graduate and you were embarking on your first job or career, I doubt you saw your launch into the working world as one and done. I doubt you thought this is it for the next 20 to 30 years. More likely, you expected to evolve over the next few decades. You were prepared to make some mistakes, but you also expected to grow and change and iterate over time. So why would your next decades be any different? You will continue to grow and improve over time, just as when you were a young adult setting out. But only if you invest in your evolution. Take an incremental and an experimental approach. Stay excited for what lies ahead. Continue growing and expanding. This is exactly what will make your next act fulfilling. And if you're already experimenting and iterating, please be sure to share your journey in the comments. I'd love to hear what you are learning from your explorations and all the adjustments you may have made as a result along the way. We all learn from each other, so your contribution to the community matters. Thanks for joining me today on Next Act Ninjas. Until next time, live well, love more, age less, my friends.